This episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of murder, dismemberment, and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. It was late afternoon on Anzac Day, 1935, and just over a dozen people were congregating at a pool in Coogee, in Sydney's eastern suburbs. It was a cool day in autumn, which meant that the pool was in fact transformed into Coogee Aquarium baths. The public weren't there to swim. They were there as spectators, because swimming inside the 50-metre pool was a 4.4 metre long tiger shark, said to be the largest ever in captivity. 14 members of the public watched on as the shark thrashed around uncomfortably, almost appearing unwell. And then, at about 4:30 p.m, the shark threw up. The contents of the shark's stomach floated to the top of the pool. First, they saw a rat, then a bird, and then another shark's fin. But there was something else. As the onlookers leaned in, they saw what appeared to be a human arm. Suddenly, a frightful stench emerged in the air. It is on this day, on the 20-year anniversary of the Gallipoli landings, that police began investigating the shark arm murder. And soon, another man would be dead. 85 years on, the story remains one of the most extraordinary cases in Australian history. I'm Jessie Stephens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Phillip, Roope, and Kevin Meagher. Phillip and Kevin are co-authors of the book Shark Arm, A Shark, a Tattooed Arm, and Two Unsolved Murders. Phillip, Roope, and Kevin Meagher are former high school English and history teachers. They collaborated on Shark Arm, throwing fresh light on one of Australia's most extraordinary murders. Let's start in April 1935 off the coast of Sydney. Two fishermen reel in a tiger shark to their vessel. What do they decide to do with that shark?
Well, the shark had been caught on a fixed line. It was a monstrous 14-foot tiger shark. An absolute monster. It had been wrapped up in all the lines they had laid with mackerel on it, and it had exhausted itself. So you couldn't normally do anything with a 14-foot tiger shark. You just have to let it go. But this one was completely exhausted, and they decided to haul it into Coogee, and they dragged it behind the boat. It was about 3 kilometres off Coogee Beach. And they dragged it to the north end of Coogee Beach, where a group of men put it on a piece of canvas, and probably about 15 men hauled it up the beach, across the road, and into the Coogee Aquarium, which was a place where during the summer people bathed, and then in the winter it was emptied out and fresh water was put in it, and they exhibited through the winter months big sharks, and this was a monster. So they managed to get the 14-foot tiger shark into the aquarium. By the way, the fisherman's brother owned the aquarium, so it wasn't just a thing just off the top of their head. So, and in fact, they had been looking for a 14-foot tiger shark, a monster. So, but that's a different story. So they put it in the pool. The shark was absolutely exhausted. It was very lethargic. It was on the bottom of the pool, but it eventually revived and started to swim around. So the Hobson brothers, they owned the aquarium, they decided that here they had a great exhibit and they could advertise it. So they got advertising out, come and see the 14-foot monster, the largest shark ever in captivity.
Look, I'm not a marine biologist, but I would imagine that keeping a shark of that size in a pool probably isn't the best thing. Is that a fair thing to say, that wasn't very good for the health of the shark?
That's very fair. In fact, they put a number of sea animals in there and not one of them survived. That sort of tells us a little bit about the values of the day and the thinking of the day about exhibiting animals in zoos and that sort of stuff. But none of these animals survived.
They even had a sea leopard in there at one time that they took from the beach in Bateman's Bay. Could you believe that? And brought it up by truck. And that died within about a week. A huge sea lion. When you see photos of the sharks in the pool, it was like an ordinary suburban pool with a deep end and a shallow end and 50 metres long. And a shark of that size, or any animal of that size, in a pool like that, it looks almost ridiculous. But that's what they did.
Unsurprisingly, the shark became unwell and ended up, when a lot of people were around, the public was there viewing this shark, it ended up regurgitating something. What did it regurgitate?
It was 4:30 in the afternoon on Anzac Day, so the aquarium was about to close. There was about 12 people there, and it thrashed around, swam vigorously in circles and up and down, and it came down to the shallow end of the pool, and it literally sank to the bottom. And soon after was when the browny, yellowy scum came to the surface. On top of the surface was floating a bird and a water rat, and then the human arm. So it was a pretty horrifying experience for the people standing there just about to go home, and they were confronted with this arm. There was no doubt it was an arm, and they pulled it in close to the side of the pool, and they called Randwick Police, and they came down and took it away.
There was a nauseating stench as well. That was also recorded as happening just after it regurgitated the arm. But it was Anzac Day 1935, so right in the middle of the Depression, and people had put together their last pennies to get in there. It was in front of 14 witnesses who all said the arm came out of the shark. It wasn't put in there and it didn't come in through, some other way. They saw it come out of the shark. And one of those people was a Sydney Morning Herald proofreader called Narcissus Leo Young. How's that for a name? And he swore that he had seen the arm come out, and no one is more exact than a proofreader.
And was there anything of note on the arm in terms of identifying who it belonged to?
Indeed there was. There was a tattoo of two boxes shaping up to each other on the on the forearm of this left arm. And that was one of the identifying items. This got mentioned in the newspaper on the following Sunday in a publication called The Truth, or just Truth, Sydney. And a man by the name of Edward Smith read the article, read the description, and rang his sister-in-law Gladys and said, "Have you seen what's in the paper today? I think this could be Jim's arm." And Gladys didn't disagree but didn't want to acknowledge it, wanted to stay in denial about it. So Edward called Newtown Police. They came around to talk to him. And the next morning, Gladys and Edward went to the police station. They saw a photograph of the arm, and Jim said, "That's my brother's arm. That's the tattoo that was on my brother's arm. There's no doubt about it."
And the police who came down to the aquarium, they fished the arm out, and it had a small piece of rope around the wrist. And they fished it out by the rope, put it on a hessian bag and examined it. It was in a perfect state of preservation. I mean, to have been in a shark, and a shark, it can eat anything and digest it. It was in a perfect state of preservation. The reason it was in a perfect state of preservation, including the tattoo and including fingerprints, a perfect set of fingerprints, was that when the shark had got on the line, it had been attracted by a smaller shark that had obviously eaten the arm at some earlier point. And that had first taken the bait, one of the lines. The larger shark had then come along and taken a big chunk out of the smaller shark. And the chunk that the big shark took out of the smaller shark contained the arm. So what the big shark that was in the pool was doing was digesting the smaller shark, not the arm. So when it finally came out, it had been swaddled in this, protective coat of shark and therefore preserved. So the police were able to cut off, they didn't have fingerprints really in those days. The way this was done was almost the first time it was ever done in Australia, and that was to cut off the skin from the fingertips, and then a detective put on a plastic glove, then put the skin on the top of the glove and then made a fingerprint that way. So they got a perfect set of prints. So when Gladys identified the arm and Edward Smith, the guy's brother, they were able to double confirm it because he had been arrested. James Smith had been arrested for a very minor charge of illegal gambling back a few years earlier. So his prints are on record, and they were able to make a perfect match. It was 100% James Smith's arm that came out of that shark.
To try and work out the probability that a shark would eat an arm, then regurgitate it at all, let alone that one shark that is in that pool, is so impossible to work out. What I want to know is, when that arm was regurgitated, why did police not think, oh, this is someone who's been a victim of a shark attack? Why did they not think that it was, someone who had died in those circumstances? Why did it become sort of a murder investigation instead?
Because they got the experts in straight away. They got the chief medical officer, Dr. Palmer, and they got an expert on shark attacks on humans from Sydney University. And they both concluded that by looking at markings on the arm, that the arm had not been torn off by a shark, but it had been cut off with a sharp instrument and possibly a kitchen knife. So they knew they had a murder investigation on their hands, but they'd concluded that the arm was actually thrown into the water rather than it being taken off a body in the shark, by a shark.
So once they identify who this belongs to, we've got Jimmy Smith. What do we know about him? As you said, he had a sort of criminal history. What kind of life did he lead?
Well, Jimmy Smith, we had so much trouble tracking. You can imagine James Smith, born somewhere in England around about 1896. That took a bit of doing. But we finally found out that he was born in London. He was, not pretty well uneducated. He was a coal miner in the north of England. And then he emigrated to Australia around about 1909. He ran a gambling betting shop in Rozelle, and he was a billiard room attendant and billiards and betting in this shop in Rozelle. He did quite well at it, but he fancied himself as an amateur boxer. And around that time, boxing was huge in Australia. So he fought at different places around Sydney and the Leichhardt Stadium and small amateur venues. And even to find any record of him boxing was really difficult as well. But from the things we found, he probably had more enthusiasm than talent. He could handle himself, but he never reached any great heights. He was a welterweight, so he was quite a large sort of man. But he was obviously in his youth running the billiard hall and doing a bit of on-the-side gambling, illegal betting. He could handle himself pretty well. It would appear he was a very likeable character. Everyone said that he was light-hearted and he was a vibrant sort of person. The more we got to know about him, the more we thought, out of any of the characters in this whole story, Jimmy Smith seemed to be the most attractive. He was probably a bit silly and prone to promoting himself, but nonetheless he managed to cultivate the friendships of people much above his rank in terms of the poor boy that came from London. He got in with a couple of North Shore businessmen who had boat building businesses, and he managed to get in with them and very soon started to, with them, carry on businesses like building blocks of flats and things with them. But his connection with these men was to prove his undoing.
Did he have a family? Who did he leave behind?
He was actually the advance party. The plan was within the family for Jim to come to Australia when he was 18, and he came out, and then his brother followed a year later, and then his family came, brothers and sisters, and ultimately, eventually, there were 13, and his mother had 13 children. Not all of them came with her at that time. She had more children when she came to Australia. So he was under a lot of pressure to have things in place for when the family came. So As Phil mentioned, he got into businesses that he may have realised he was being used. He may have felt there was a bit of a scam running there, but he went on with it and was paid and he had money, and then the Depression came on, so it was even harder to get work. So he, like many men of that time, were desperate for dough. They had to pay the rent. They had to put the food on the table. Many men, including Jim Smith, got offers to do things that they probably would not have done at other times.
He also had a wife called Gladys Malloy, and he married her in about 1916, and they had a young son called Raymond, only had the one son. And we never found out what Gladys did, but she was often away from home. But they seemed to have a very loving relationship, and after he disappeared, she went to great lengths to find out what had happened to him. She attended the inquests and everything, even though the evidence was so gruesome about what had happened. But she
actually had to go and look at the arm itself. She'd originally seen a photograph, hadn't she? And then in the second day of the inquest, Clive Evatt, was insistent that she definitely identify the arm, and so they called, in the first hour of the second day, she went and actually saw what was left of his arm, which wasn't a lot, but she identified it as being definitely Jim Smith's arm, her husband's arm.
She stood up to the police really strongly. In court, Evatt asked, trying to get at her, saying, "How do you know that your husband is dead?" And she first admitted that she took it from the detectives. The detectives said he was dead. And Evatt said, "Well, can you believe the detectives?" And she sort of got the drift of what way he was going. And she screamed at him, "If my husband was alive, do you think he would not have contacted me?" So she gave back as good as she got.
Didn't Evatt say to her at that time, "That's not the question I asked you"? And she chimed in beautifully and said, "Well, I'm telling you, that's the situation."
Exactly. That's don't you think he'd contact me?
She didn't take a backward step in the court. She was a strident but very strong woman.
The investigation quite quickly led police to Reggie Holmes. What sort of life did Reggie live?
Reggie was part of harbour royalty. His forebears had been on the harbour for, like 100 years. He had forebears in New Zealand, and they were all in the shipbuilding business. But his father in particular was renowned for building anything, luggers to speedboats to luxury cruisers to ferries, yachts. They could build anything. So the Holmes name on the harbour was royalty. Reg Holmes lived in a house overlooking his boatyard in Lavender Bay and, looking down to what is now Luna Park and the bridge beyond. They lived a very good life, but it was rumoured that he had a drinking problem and he also possibly had a drug problem as well.
And what kind of drug problem? So we're during the Great Depression. What sort of drug problem was existed then?
Quite a big problem in Sydney. It was said that per capita of population, Sydney was the cocaine capital of the world. And it's very surprising.
I didn't know that.
Most people are surprised to hear that, yeah. That came in from South America, but heroin was around as well, and that came in from Asia. There was lots of talk that the boats associated with Holmes and another businessman by the name of Stannard were involved in moving those drugs around off boats into ports in part of Sydney, where they were distributed from there.
And so how did Reggie know Jim? What was their connection?
Well, it all stems back to the Pathfinder, and the Pathfinder was a beautiful Queensland-built walnut interior, beautiful big long yacht, and it had only been built in the late 20s and had come down to Sydney. Holmes had seen it up at Pittwater. And he and a group of businessmen, including Albert Stannard, decided that they would get Jim Smith to look after it. They would insure it for a lot more than it was worth. So that was done by getting a marine surveyor in and then talking the price up and saying, oh, this is beautiful, and finally he signed off on it. And so why wouldn't you? Because, he's a man telling you this boat is worth a certain amount of money. And he got the boat valued. They bought it for about $3,500, and within a few weeks, using a couple of dummy owners, not buying it in their name, but using a couple of dummy owners, they insured it for more than $8,500. So in today's money, it's like we're talking an increase in about $500,000 in the value of the boat. So then insurance fraud was on their minds. So Jimmy Smith was told he would get £500 if he took the boat out, the Pathfinder, off the coast and sink it and come back and tell the story of how it sank, and then they'd all collect the money and, make a killing. But it just didn't work out like that.
Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong.
In what way? What went wrong?
Well, he chose to sink it at night by smashing some inlet pipes for the bathroom, and he thought it would go down pretty quickly. They'd already loaded it up with lots of sandstone so it would go down, but it didn't go down quickly at all.
They sailed it to just off Terrigal, about a mile off the coast from Terrigal.
So come morning, the boat's low in the water, but it hadn't sunk. Jimmy was just about to abandon ship and row, as the plan was, when a collier, a coal-carrying boat, came from the north. It was coming from Catherine Hill Bay with a load of coal, as they did, just about 4 or 5 times a week. And the captain changed course and offered Jim a lift or some help. And Jim just waved him off and said, "Go, it's all right," and rowed to shore and got to shore, but only just. The collier captain reported it to the police, and everything started to unravel from there. The insurers raised the alarm too. They found out that Jim was the only man on the boat. They got a bit suspicious. They called the police as well. So the police were getting these reports from 2 independent sources, and finally they interviewed Jim Smith, and that was the beginning of another episode in the life of Jim Smith.
We believe this is at the heart of the story.
Yeah.
This bungled sinking. Jim Smith couldn't have done it worse. When he got to Terrigal and went into the police station, he told the policeman who rang up for him to tell the owner of the boat that it had sunk. He named Holmes. He said, "I'd like to speak, if you could get Mr. Holmes for me." So the police had it all, and he'd bungled it. And then the policeman who interviewed him was a detective sergeant called Matthews, Frank Matthews, and he was to become the star detective in the murder. But he actually interviewed Jim Smith after this. This is a year before Jim Smith's death. And he interviewed him. And Matthews was a very hard cop. And he must have got to Jim Smith and rattled him completely, because he wrote a report in the files that we have that said that he wasn't satisfied after the first interview, so he got him back for another interview. And he said, and when compared, the 2 places the boat apparently sank were completely different. So he made a complete mess of it, and the police were onto him. The businessmen couldn't realise their profit. It was all down the drain, and all due to this stupid Jim Smith.
It's almost endearing. The errors are almost endearing when you look at it.
Well, had Smith accepted the lift from the collier captain, the whole story would have been very different. Got back to shore, explained things, and they would have, oh, that's bad luck about the boat sinking. But these guys lost a lot of money. Holmes and Stannard lost a lot of money when that boat went down, because they ended up withdrawing the claim. It got too hot for them, so they pulled the claim.
So when the police then ask Holmes if he has any connection to Smith, because they found this arm and they want to know what's happened to him, what does he say? Does he tell them this story? Does he say that he knows him and that they've had kind of business dealings together? Or how does he kind of interact with the police?
By that stage, the police were well known that Smith had worked for Holmes on the building of the flats and also in the looking after of the Pathfinder. So Holmes didn't deny that at all. He denied another friendship, but that's a little bit further down, but not very far down the track.
Yeah. No, Holmes played a straight bat, and he said he was an employee and he mucked up the sinking, the ship sank, and that was it as far as they were concerned. But all the businessmen all fell in a heap. The police records later show that they were all absolutely terrified because not only had they lost a vast amount of money, their reputations were at stake. They had been caught red-handed trying to commit a huge marine fraud. And but the strange thing was when they dropped the claim, Matthews also didn't pursue it. And here was a very, very obvious case of an intended fraud. And
For some reason, we don't know why.
Well, what we do suspect in one of those interviews that nothing was proceeded with, that the suggestion might have been made to Jim Smith, if you become an informer of mine, we'll just forget about this one, but you can be very handy for me in the future. And then this plays into what later happened.
So who was it that Holmes denied knowing when asked by the police?
A man named Patrick Brady. Patrick Brady was Smith's best mate. When Smith disappeared, Patrick Brady was the man that the police went after relentlessly and unswervingly. They put all their eggs in the Patrick Brady basket because Patrick Brady, or Paddy, was with Smith on April the 8th down at Cronulla, and that was when Smith disappeared. Their conclusion was that Brady killed his mate. They didn't have a motive. They didn't suggest a motive. But Patrick Brady did some unusual things in the 2 or 3 days after, like cleaning up the house where it was suspected that Smith was killed, replacing a couple of items of furniture which the police suspected were used in the dumping of the body of Smith. And at one stage they got Patrick Brady in his statement mentioned Holmes's name. They called Holmes in and said, do you know this man? Holmes said, no, I don't know this man. And the police asked, Brady, do you know this man? Yeah, that's Mr. Holmes. So later, Holmes had to change his story and he sort of rolled over in some ways.
They had very good reason to suspect Patrick Brady. They had really good reason. In the days after James Smith was last seen, he drove around with a taxi driver and he bought a steel trunk about the size that could fit a human body, less an arm. Well, maybe not. And he also bought rugs and a mattress. And he also replaced, at some point, ropes and an anchor out of a launch he had hired with the cottage. He cleaned the cottage. The cottage was spotless, and Patrick Brady was not a man who cleaned up much. So they had really good reason. He never gave any explanation. He denied being in the first interviews. He denied being in Sydney. He denied being down in Cronulla. But the police had enough information and finally, a little bit into the interview, he was forced to say, yes, I was down at Cronulla. So he denied it, but the police had all this information as to his taxi movements in the days after James Smith was last seen. And putting two and two together, they decided that Brady had killed his mate, for whatever reason, in the cottage. A lot of blood had been, had got around in that gruesome cutting off of the arm, put in the trunk, taken out in the launch and dumped either near the cottage in the deep waters of Port Hacking or out into the open ocean. So they almost immediately started searching for the trunk, and for the first time in Australian history, planes were used for an aerial search. And in the second search, which was using an RAAF plane, the observer saw what he thought was a trunk, a black object on the sandy bottom just near the cottage. They threw a marker down. They landed at Mascot Airport. The detectives rushed back to Cronulla, but by that time the marker had disappeared. In the end, they didn't find the trunk, and therefore they never found Jim Smith's body.
So they're lacking evidence at this point, and the police are sort of going after Reggie as well to see if he might know more than he's letting on. In sort of late May, he attempts to end his life, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
And what happens?
He filled himself up with brandy. He took one of the speedboats that belonged to his boat shed, and he went out onto the harbour and he put a gun to his head, pulled the trigger, and the bullet just got stuck in the skull. It knocked him out of the boat, but it didn't go further than the skull. So he climbed back aboard and then went on this crazed journey up the harbour at high speeds with the police after him. And he eluded them, and even at one stage he went outside the heads. Eventually he came back, and his brother was with the police boat, and they eventually calmed him down and took him to hospital. But it was clear that once the arm was found, everything changed for Holmes and possibly for his business associate, Stannard. Brady was in jail at the time, so he wasn't associated with any of that. But lots of question marks came into the police. Lots of questions came to the police about Holmes's possible involvement in the killing of Smith. When they brought him back, they didn't take him to the hospital. They took him down to police headquarters and asked him lots of questions, and it became clear then that this was good news for the police, because the police were talking to him on a regular basis, and he would become, in the eyes of the police, he would become a star witness at the upcoming inquest into the death of James Smith.
We should bring Ione Holmes into the story here, because she was a tall, elegant North Shore wife. She, to the police and in the court, said that she knew nothing about her husband's business. She took no interest in it at all. But in fact, she was very heavily involved in all the goings-on around the wharves, and she knew as much as anyone about what her husband was up to. And on the day he was out of his mind and crazed and careening around the harbour on the speedboat, she was rung up by Albert Stannard. Stannard said, "Send a boat over to get your husband." And the good friend didn't try and help Holmes himself, but he asked the wife to send a boat over for her husband, who just shot himself in the head. It's all so bizarre. And then later on, when she found out that he was in custody and he was all right and he was going to live, she didn't visit him. She ended up at the hospital that night, but stayed with him for about a minute and then left. So Holmes was absolutely friendless. His business was going down the gurgler. His reputation was shot to pieces, especially after this ridiculous episode on the harbour. His wife seemed to have very little interest in what happened to him. In fact, you can almost read into it, "Oh, for God's sake, Reg, get it over and done with." He'd had a mental breakdown. There's no two ways about it. He was in a dreadful, dreadful state. But the police were onto her as well, to be quite honest, and very interesting story there.
The pressure was mounting on Holmes because the inquest into Smith's death was coming up, and that was scheduled for June 12.
So what story did Reggie eventually tell the police when he was ready to talk?
In a nutshell, he said that Patrick Brady told him that he'd killed his mate James Smith and cut up his body and dumped it in the ocean. That's the very short version of it. And that was in some ways music to the police's ear, because this was going to be a great piece of evidence in the coronial inquest, and the coroner had the right to send someone to trial. It wasn't looking good at that stage for Pat Brady.
And so was Holmes saying that he had no involvement other than knowing that it had happened because he'd had some sort of confession?
Yeah, the pressure mounted on Holmes as the coronial inquest was approaching. The matter of the arm had come up. Brady and Holmes had a long conversation about the arm. Brady said, "This is Jim's arm. What are we going to do about it?" Holmes said, No, that's not Jim's arm. You're fussing about something. You're worrying about something needlessly. I'm going off to Melbourne on a business trip. So Holmes didn't want to face it, but Brady was very concerned about it because he knew he was the last man with Smith and he would cop the blame. He said, at one stage, I'm not going to carry the baby on this.
So Reggie was to be the Crown's sort of star witness, the person that would, tie their case together. But he never made it, did he?
No, Reg didn't get there.
And why didn't he get there?
On about 6 o'clock on the night of June the 11th, he went home, had some dinner, went and had a short sleep, told his wife he had to go out around about 8 o'clock, said he'd be back around 9:30. He drove his car from the North Sydney over to the Hickson Road, which is on the southern side of the Harbour Bridge. He parked the car there and he was shot 3 times there in the side, in his left side. The police found him dead around about 11 o'clock that night.
He was in the car and he was in a very strange position, as though he had his knuckles on his knees. He was sort of bent slightly forward. His hat was on the back of his head. And it was, for all intent and purposes, it looked like he had got himself ready to be killed. He had positioned himself in a sort of calm posture, almost just waited for it to happen.
And there are a few theories about that, because there's a theory that he was shot because he sort of knew too much and he was going to testify, and that it's obviously something that would scare someone who's guilty, but also that perhaps he kind of ordered his own hitman to then not be stuck in that position. What do you guys think? Where do you land on that kind of debate?
Just to add one thing, he went and saw his solicitor that afternoon on June the 11th, and his solicitor had nothing but bad news for him, because the solicitor said to him, you may well be charged out of this inquest as being an accessory to the crime. So the pressure just seemed to step up. At every turn, the pressure seemed to step up just a little bit on Reg Holmes. Were you going to say something, Phil, about the...
Well, he was just, just remembering that he was hardly stable, and this is not too long after his sensational harbourside antics. And we think that he, on that afternoon, late in that afternoon, after he talked to his friend Stannard in a car for about 20 minutes, what happened in that car is probably, it came down to one man saying, I just can't go on. I can't face a top silk tomorrow questioning me for hour upon hour as to, what's happened. And he said, I'll buckle. His friend, who was equally interested in his reputation, in some way finding a way out for his friend. Almost, it's a bizarre thing to happen, but it must have happened in that 20 minutes, because he made a decision to come back and have himself killed.
And do you think that implies a level of guilt or a level of being trapped? Because it's sort of him positioned between this Sydney underworld, which is, I would imagine, incredibly scary, and also, sitting in court. So there is no positive outcome in this. So do you think that it was that he was guilty in some way, or that he was scared?
Look, I think when he was being brought back on the police boat after the chase, and he was still drunk and delirious from the bullet in his head, he said to Matthews, Jim Smith is dead, and there's one more to go. If you let me get to him, I'll do it tonight. So he was delirious. But it was like he was making a list. And to us, those comments are like suddenly a light went off. Are these murders connected? Is he not just worried about his reputation? Is there something else that's really just driven him to hell? And I believe, yes, it was that he knew that he was trying to convict a man and possibly hang him on false evidence of a crime that he knew he had not committed, and he knew that he had been intimately involved in, and he knew who had done it.
And so what happened with the court case? So they've lost their star witness. What was the outcome of a case that lacked evidence?
Despite the fact that they didn't have, this is the coronial inquiry, didn't have Holmes there to give evidence, the magistrate still sent him to trial for Jim Smith's murder. But the police had no body, they had no motive, and all the other evidence was sat fairly in the circumstantial box. And at one stage, Evatt, who was the barrister for Brady, spoke to the judge and said, well, shall we call this off, basically? The judge heard a little bit more evidence, and then he basically instructed the jury to find Pat Brady not guilty of Jim Smith's murder. And that was the end of it, as far as Jim Smith, as far as the culpability went.
So all these years later, with all the evidence that you've gathered, what do you think happened? What do you think happened to this man whose arm ended up in a shark?
Look, it is the great cover-up. I think it's a great cover-up of Sydney history. We believe that not just a couple of people knew what happened to Jim Smith, but in fact scores of people knew what had happened to Jim Smith. And 85 years later, this silence is still around, that people knew that Jim Smith, as a police informer and the bungling scuttling of the Pathfinder, and then him blackmailing other people to try and get his money for that thing that he bungled, put him in the bad books with a lot of dangerous people. And he was quite efficiently disposed of, and had not a shark vomited up his arm, we would not be sitting here and his name would never have been mentioned again. But it was. The shark regurgitated the arm. The light was turned on in a very dark room to give for a moment a glimpse of the underworld and what was happening. And it was a terrifying, for people who were involved, including the relatives, the witnesses, even the accused, it was a terrifying period to try and get through that and switch the light off again. And eventually it was. It was switched off by fear and money. Fear and money finally bought the verdict that the guilty wanted. And Patrick Brady went along with it because he knew he was probably very lucky to escape that night in the cottage. And if he had been a little bit slower in getting away, he would have been overboard as well. And he kept silent right to the grave until 1965 when he died. He never revealed who did it. He hinted at some people, but they were obviously, we just don't believe that they were serious contenders. And he kept saying, people call me the shark arm murderer, but I've been acquitted in a court of law. And so if I said to you right now I had done it, I couldn't be retried for it. And he said, I say to you now, I didn't do it. And we believe he definitely didn't do it. 100% he didn't do it. And we do know who did it.
Who did it?
There's a great book out there called Shark Arm by Phillip, Roope and Kevin Meagher, and that tells everything.
I can confirm it is a very, very good book. Thank you so much for speaking to us. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Great
Thanks,
to be
Jessie.
here.
You can find Phillip Roope and Kevin Meagher's gripping whodunit, Shark Arm, a shark, a tattooed arm, and Two Unsolved Murders at all good bookstores, online, and via the link in the description of this episode. To see photos of the shark, archival footage from the case, and find more information on Phillip and Kevin's research, join our closed Facebook group. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stephens, and produced by Elise Cooper.